Hello, today I will create a Laravel simple course tutorial about creating employee timesheet web API. Will looks like the tables here, which will have name, date, time in, and time out, simple stuff like that. And we can start from the user stories. So for the background, as an HR, I want to manage employee data. And the next is, as an HR, I want to get a record of my employee attendance so I know their working hours. Also, for an employee, I want to record clock in and clock out so I have record for my attendance. We can start designing an API for our application. For example, for the start, we have three category here: authorizations, users, and attendance. For the out, we can have a register API, login API, logout API, and the reset password. For the users, we can have a user list that lists all the user in our database, and then the user details for single user data, also updating user and delete. For the attendance, what we will need is the clock in, clock out, and we will have the user reports that will contain all the data from a particular user. And the last is all user reports, that's give reports of all the user and their respective attendance data. And from the design, we can start designing a database. In here, I only use 3 tables, and between tables they have a one-to-many relationship. From the first table, we read it from right to left. We will have roles which contains an admin roles or HR roles and the usual employee roles. And we will have a users table which will contain name, email, and password. Also the role ID, which is a foreign key from the role tables. And the third table is the attendance table, which will have a date, clock in and clock out, and with user ID, which is a foreign key from the users table. So this table will have a one-to-many relationship. One roles can have multiple users, and one users can have multiple attendance. After we create this database design, you can create in any platform. For me, I use dbdesigners.net for designing a table before we create anything. And the next step, we will have to create the application in the Laravel. For creating the Laravel application from scratch, because I'm using Windows, I will use PowerShell to initialize the project. First, we open the PowerShell and go to the directory that we want our project is installed, and the command will be composer create project Laravel / Laravel and the name of the project. In our case, the name of the project will be Laravel dash employee dash time sheet, and we can start create and initialize our project in that folder. After finish, now you can open that project in IDE. For me, I use Visual Studio Code. This is new initialized Laravel project, and we already have several folders here like app, bootstrap, and others. But for the first, now we focus on the database, and we can see the migration script here. Some are already defined, like creating the users table, password reset, and others. But because for the scope in this course, we don't use all of the default table, and we can delete some that we are not using, such as the password reset table and the failed job tables. We will use the personal access token for the users to still log in during the API operations. Now, after deleting the unnecessary table, we go to the app and see the models. The models here is like the table that we will have in the database. Now the users table has been defined by default by Laravel. We'll just make use of this already created table, and now we add the tables, which is roles and attendance. For the first, we create the roles table with the artisan command. You can open the terminal, and to make a new model, we go with the command php artisan make model role. But we also creating the migrations with this command with the -m command. It stands for the migrations. So with this command we will create a new model role and a new migration script that will create that roles table, and we just press enter. Now we have the role models here, and also creating the roles migration table here. In the roles, this is already add by default that the table will have ID and timestamps. Now we just need to add one more variable for this table, which is the name. We will make the migrations scripts with Laravel Eloquent that have already many methods designed to easily create tables for us. And to add the name variables, we code with table and the data type, which is string, and the name column, which is name. So we will have a roles table with column ID, name, and also the timestamps, which will translate it in the database with a column created at and updated at. And in this reverse scenario, if we want to roll back, it's already defined. If we want to roll back, it will delete or drop the roles table. After we create roles table, the next step is to adding the role ID to the users table. This is the users table column already defined by default. We can edit, we can delete, but for now we just let it be like this and add the new column role ID with the new migration script. To do that, we simply add a new artisan command, php artisan make migration, and the name of the migrations, which is add role ID to users table. With this naming conventions, it will help the Laravel to detect that we want to add something to the users table. So when we press enter and see the migration script, it already know that we will edit or update the users table. And now we can add the variable which is role ID. So table pick integer with the name column which is role ID. Also we add unsigned. The unsigned is to make sure that there is no negative value, and also the column is maybe null, so it's nullable. After add the column, now we add the relationships from the role ID to the ID from the roles table. So it would be table foreign and the name of the column which is role ID. It will reference on the column ID on the table of roles. For reverse scenario, so the first step would be drop or remove the foreign relationship, which will be table drop foreign, and it as the index of it, so we cannot just type the name, but we will give the index of it, which can be achieved by enclosing in the square brackets. Now it will give the index of the column role ID to the method, and after we drop the foreign relationship, we drop the column. Now it asks for the column, and we can just type the column name, which is role ID. And for the last model and the last migrations, we will create a attendance model. So the command still the same. We're creating a model PHP artisan make model attendance, and we also creating the migration script. Now we have the new attendance model and the new migration for creating the attendance table. Now we add the necessary column that we have designed previously. So the column would be the data type is date and the name is also date, and next is data type is date time and the column name is clock in. We also create the same one for the clock out. We can also directly creating the foreign key for the user's ID in here. So it would be table big integer user ID, and it is unsigned. Now we add the foreign relationship for the user ID, table foreign, the column name is user ID, and it will reference on the column ID on the table users. So we also can add the conditional if the users are deleted, and so the attendance are deleted with cascade on delete. For the reasons why I use a big integer and unsigned for the user ID, because the user ID itself in the users this ID, if we look into it, it return a big increment, and if we check what is the big increment is unsigned and is big integer. That's why in the our table in the create attendance, the user ID is big integer and it is unsigned. Also for the additional logic, and here we can add the new label, because when the first time user clock in, the clock out is maybe null. So that's for the attendance table. After creating the migration, the next step is creating the database itself. There are several tools for database to use. For me, I use Table Plus. First, I connect to my local and choose to create new database. For example, the name is Laravel timesheet, and then just click OK. After created, the next step is to change the env file in here. You can find in the .env file and change the database connections. I use local connection here, and the database name will be changed to Laravel underscore timesheet that we just created earlier. After we click save, we open the new terminal again and do the migrations with command php artisan migrate, and let's see if our table are correct and created. Now all the tables are created, and we can check in the tools that we have. In here there are already users table, roles table, and attendance table, and still empty. After the migration itself, the next step is to add the relationship of the class or model in Laravel. We can do that steps in app folder and models folders. Here we can find the model, and let's start from the role. From the database design, the role itself has one-to-many relationship with user, where one role can have multiple users. So we define the relationship inside the model with public function user. And we can return this has many, the related table, which is a user class. And that's it. We already defined the relationship. We also need to tell the user class about the relationship. We open here, still the same, public function and role, but this time it returns belongs to relationship with a role model. So role class, and just to play safe, in here we can write the foreign key in here, which is role ID inside the user class or user model. Besides the relationship between the role and user, the user still have the other relationship with attendance, where one user can have multiple attendance. So we can define it also. Public function attendance, and we'll return this has many attendance class. And same with user, it will need to write the attendance relationship also in here with user, public function user, and we can return the belongs to relationship. with the foreign key of user ID. So like in the design earlier, role can have multiple user, and user belongs to the role, and user can have multiple attendance, and the attendance belongs to user. Now the next step is to initialize the data for roles, and we can use database seeder to do that. Next we can go to the under database and seeders folder and click database seeders. In here we can run any method to initialize data. For this time it will be roles with the help of role class. Next we import the role class first. Use app models and role. We will create roles here. The first role would be admin and the second role would be employee. To do that we type role update or create. This method takes two parameters. The first one would be ID, and the second one would be the name. The first parameter, it will check if there are already data with ID number 1, and if it exists it will update the name to be admin. But if the ID number 1 is not exist, then it will be create the role object with ID 1 and name admin. So that's the first role, and the second role would be admin. I mean employee. The ID is 2 and the name would be employee, because you see in the roles table we only have ID and name and the timestamps, so just 2 data is enough to create the roles. And then we click save. To run this command we will type in the PHP artisan db seed. This command will be run this method, the run method, and because in here we have to create or update method, after this command it will create 2 roles for us. Let's try, and we can check in here. It's already created 2 roles, which is admin and employee. Now we are back into the models, and we can see here in the user model there are a protected field called field label. It means that we can fill this information when we create a new model or assign a value to a model. For example, in the user table we add the role ID parameter, then now we should add that variable to this fillable array. So let's fill that up, role ID, and it's the same with the attendance, so it should create one for attendance too with the protected fillable. And let's see what's the parameter in the attendance table. ID usually is not fillable, so you cannot edit the ID, but you can fill the date, clock in, clock out, and also the user ID. So we will put these 4 variable into the fillable array. Dates, clock in, clock out, and the user ID. Now it's time to create some API. At first we need to create the controller, and our first controller is the out controller. To do that, we can type in the terminal php artisan make controller, and the name will be out controller. And after created, we can see in the app HTTP controller and the out controller. The first function would be the register, so let's create the function register. For the parameter, we expect a request object. In here, at first we will do the validation input. After it valid, then it will create a user object and then assign roles to that user object. And then we create the token for user to still log in the next request. And the last would be return the response. In the Laravel, the request object have a function to validate the input. There are several roles that we can use to validate the input. For the first, we create the validated object, and we can get that from request validate, and we simply setting the roles that we want to validate in here. So for register a user, what would be need is the first is the name, and then email, and then password. The value in the right side here would be the rules that we want to use to validate. So for example, for the name we will use the rules require. So that means that for this request, it is required to have an email parameter. For email, also required to have more than one rows. We can still use with one string and separate it with separator. so it will be required, and the format should be email, and the email should be unique inside the users table. So in this roles unique, it will check the table user. If there is any same email, it will reject, so the input is not valid. And for the password is also required, and we can have additional rules, which is minimum, for example 8 digits. So in this object we got the key value pair of all of this: name, email, and password. And next we will create the user object. So let's create a variable for the user, and we can call it the user class to create inside this user creation. We fill the information that are needed, so it will be name, and we got it from this object, validated with the value of name. And same for the others. Email, we got it from the validated, and the key will be email. After the user is created in this object, the next step is we are assigning roles, because in the user class we still have a available field, which is the role ID. It is a nullable, so it's okay if we are not filling right away. We can actually pass the role ID in here. For example, role ID, if we have already know what is the number, for example 2, but for this case I'm not gonna use it. I'm using the more descriptive ways, so let's delete this. And the first we got the roles, the employee roles. In this object, employee roles is role where name is employee. And to get that object, we put it with first. At first we need to import that role model, and next we add the user object to the roles. With employee role, it will call the user object like we define in here. We can call the user object and let it save this user. After we assign the roles, next step is we create the token, and let's save the token object in this variable. We will using a user object to create the token, so user create token, and it expect the name, for example API token, and we will return the plain text token of this token object. So where do we have this method. First we go to the user class. It have a thread has API tokens, and if we go look inside this threads, it have this method which is create token and expect a name string, and other have default value, but this one should be assigned, and we assign it with API underscore token, and it return the new access token. And if we go look inside this new access token object, it have two fields here. The first one is the access token, is the object, and the second one is the token but in the plain text versions. That plain text token version is what we will send back to the user here. Now after we create the token, it's time to return it. So let's have a response variable that have a user and the token, let's say access token. And we'll return this array with return response JSON, and we passing that data, array data, with the status is 201. The 201 is usually used for the new created resource. I forgot that we need to encrypt or hash the password before it is saved to the database, and we will use a hash class which is already installed default by Laravel. This class Illuminate support package hash, so we call the method to make the hash password. Also we need to import the library Illuminate support package and hash. Next step, we create the routes for the API. We can go to the routes folder here and find the api.php. This is the default one, and we can comment on this one and create our routes, and it will be grouped by the controller. So the code will be root controller, and the controller class which is out controller, and we can group all the function inside the out controller. The first API is the register, and we can have register here, the URI, and the action which is the method in here, also the register. Now we can open the Postman to test the API. First, let's create the collection. And let's add the first request. That would be the post request. The URL in the local should be http localhost port 8000 API register. And for the body, the parameter would be name, email, and password. So let's go for example. To run the application, we open the terminal and run the command php artisan serve. Now we can see that it is running on the localhost on the port 8000. Now let's try to test the API. Is already created with two objects. The first is user, which contain name, email, and others, and the second is the access token. Let's check on the database to see the users. In here you can see in the users table already have the name, email, and the hash password with the role ID of 2, which is employee. And in the personal access token, we already have one API token so that the user can log in with this token. The next function would be login, and let's create the method public function login, and we're expecting a request object. At first would be validation and attempt authentication with the input. If succeed, there would be two scenarios. The first succeed and else would be false. If false, then we return response unauthenticated. If succeed, then we will be return token response. So the token must be created first, and to create token we will need a user object. Okay, let's start from the validation. As usual, let's create a array object of the validated input. Request validate. The first would be email. It is required and it must be an email format. Next is password, and it's required. To do the attempt authentication, we will import a library, the auth library. We can import it right now. Illuminate, support, facets, and out. This would be the method out attempt. The credential array would be from the validated. If we check, it will return a boolean whether it succeeds or not, and it is accepting a credential array which we already passed with the email and password. So we can put the conditional here. If succeed, if true, then this is what we will do. If false, then we will return an authenticated response. To get the user object, we can use Eloquent ORM with the user class user where email is the same with validated email. Because the email is unique, there is guaranteed that only one object of email in the database, so it can be called with first. And then we will create a token from the user object, user create token, and the name of the token, which is API token in here, API token with the plain text token format. This will be here. And the last step is returning the response. First we create the response object, is an array. Data with the value of the access token. And we'll return this object in JSON. This would be just a response function. If the authentication is failed, then we will return a failed response. JSONs, and the message of unauthenticated, and the status would be 401 for the incorrect password or authentication fail. That's all for the login function. Next, we adding the API in here. The login would be a post request, and the URL would be login, and the action would be the same, which is login. Let's try to run this. PHP artisan serve. Now we can test in the Postman. So let's create a new one. Add request. be login, apples, we can copy from here, this change to login, and the body we can input email and the password. Let's look at the previous user that we created earlier. This is the email and the password is secret passwords. So let's test that and let's see if we can log in. And it succeeds. It gives the response of the access token. And if we see in the database, the user still one and the personal access token, now there are two of them. And let's try if we, let's say, not sending the password, what will be the response? This is happen because we don't specify that we expecting a JSON response. So in order to get the JSON response, what we would do is change the header value to application JSON. We just create a new key and disable this one. And for the value would be application/JSON. So if we try to send the request again, it will give a JSON response with the 422 status because our password field is not exist here because we disable it. This would be the response. If we fill the password but it is the wrong one, it should send back the response of the unauthenticated, the 401 status. So for now the login API is working correctly. For the next API would be the logout functions. So let's create that. Public function logout, and we expecting a request object. This would be more simple than the other because what we will do in here is just delete the access token. So that would be request and get the user object, and then we get the tokens object, and then we will delete that token. After that we can return the response. Response JSON, and for the logout it can be null with the status of 204, which means no content are returned. And for the API we will add a post operation logout with the action or function name is same logout, but this time we will need authentications before the user can do a logout. So we will add a middleware in here, and we specify the name of the middleware, which is outsanctum, and that's it. You can trying the logout API. Let's create a new request. we can copy from here. This would be logout, and it won't send any parameter, but we will add the authorization in here in the bearer token. Let's running up the server first. And try to log in again to get the access token. This would be the access token, and we can copy in the authorizations and bearer token. First, let's check in the database and hit a refresh. Now there are 3 access token here, and if we hit the API for logout, it will delete all the token from this user. So let's try. It gives response 204, which means succeed. And if we refresh in the database, all the access token is gone and the user already logged out successfully. And the last API for this controller is reset password. Let's create that, expecting a request object. What we will do in here is first the validation input, and then from the input we can change the password. But before we can change the password, we need to get the user object first. After it changed successfully, we can update the user and delete the remaining token from the user. And the last is to returning the response. Let's try from the top. As usual, we create the array object, request, validate, and there are more complex things to do when to reset password, but for the scope of this course, it's just a simple reset password function. So it only expects one parameter, which is the password. And the validation would be it required. Also, it's still the same with the register, which is the minimum length is 8. That's for the validation. Next, we get the user object from the request. And then we will change the password with user and password. We directly change the data in the database with the similar method in register, which is we need to hash the password first. So it hash make validated of the password. Because the user object is in the application, we need to update it in the database. So it would be user and then save. Next is deleting the token, the similar with the previous logout. So it would be user tokens and then delete. So after this function, the user need to log in again with the new password. And for the response would be a response object it containing a data with the message of, let's say, password change successfully. Then we can return that response object. Response, and the status would be 200. Let's check for a second. This should be token function, so it's the same in here, token function. And next we go to the API root, so it would be a post request and reset password. The action name would be the function name, which is reset password. And still the same, we need to add the middleware out sanctum. Now let's try this API. We run the application running first. You can copy from this one. Reset password, reset password, and the body would only expecting a password. So in login here, our password is secret password, and when we reset password, we change that to, for example, new password. Because in the previous logout we don't have any token, so let's try to login first. This is our only access token for now, and we put in here in the bearer token. Now let's try to hit the API, and it return succeed. And let's check in the database that it should be gone, and we will try to log in with the new password, so it should be changed. Let's try with the old password first. It unauthorized, and if we change to the new one, now it can log in, and this is our new access token. Now after the out controller is finished, the next controller is user controller. So to create the controller, it's the same with out controller, php artisan make controller and user controller. Let's open user controller. The first function is the index, so we would like to show all the users. Public function index, what we need to get is first all the users, user all, but we need to import the model first. After we get all user, then we can return it. Return response JSON, and let's wrap inside the data and users with the status of 200. And next we add the root, because this would be different controller. Let's add the new one, so it will be root, to simplify, because all the API will use middleware of the authentication. We put the middleware specification in here, so it out sanction, and the rest is the same. Controller, we specify the name, and group it. The first would be index. It is a get operations with the URL of users and with the function of index. Let's run the application first. PHP artisan serve. So let's open the Postman. We can create the new endpoint, maybe copy from here and change to get, and change login to users. We don't need anybody parameter, and that's it. We can try to test the API. I forgot to get the authorizations. Let's log in once again. I think the last time is new password is the password, so we will use this token to get the user list. Authorization bearer token, user list, and try to send the API. Right now we only have one user, and it is wrapped in the data and in an array. So maybe to test we can create another account. For now the only way to add the account is using the register, so let's try a new one. We add another user, so if we retry the API, this should be send a list of 2 users. The first is Codadig and the second is the Coda user. After the user list, the next API is the user details. So let's create the function public function in Laravel is usually named as show, where it expecting an ID. First we need to get the user object based on the ID. So user where ID is equal to ID, and to get the object, because we know that only one object, we can use first. If it not found, we can do a conditional. If not found, then we return the 404 response. Response JSON and a message of, for example, user not found, and the status is 404. If it's found, then we can return the user. Return response JSON, the user, and the status of 200. Next we add the root. This would be a GET request with the URL of users/did, and the action of show. That's it. Save and we can run the application. PHP artisan serve. Back again to Postman. We can copy this request, change the name to, for example, user details. It have no body, and we are using the same token like in here. So now there are only two users, ID 2 and 3. So let's test for ID number 2. After the slash, it gives us the correct response. Check number 3, also correct response. And for example, if to find a user that does not exist, also correct, it return a 404 not found and the message. Next function is to update. So let's create the method public function update. In here we expecting a request object and the ID. We will do a input validation and then get user object, then update the user, and the last is returning a response. So let's start from the validation. As usual, we create the object of the input after validation. Validated request, validate, and we expecting two parameter. First is the name of the employee, and it is required, and the second is the email, also required, and it should be an email format. And next we get the user object. User is user where the ID is equal to ID from here, and we get the first object. If it not exists, we simply return a not found response. A message of user not found. Then the next step is update the user. So after get the user object, we change the name directly from the validated input of the name. And second is the email. And we need to do the save function here to update in database, and then we return the response. Of the user, and the status would be 200, and then we can save. Next we can add the route. The operation is put, and the URL is similar like get details, so users and the ID with the function of update. Now we can run the applications. And open Postman to test. Now we have two users with ID 2 and 3. We're gonna update user with ID number 3, the name and the email. So let's create a request first for update user. We can copy from here, change the title to update, change the operation to put, and the ID of the user that we want to update, so it's 3. And for the body parameter, we can send it in JSON format, so it require a name, for example John, and the email, for example new email. The ID is here to update the user number 3, and let's try to send the request. Now it's successful. We have the user ID number 3 with the new name and email, and let's check in the user list if it is successfully changed the user. Now it's updated in here too. So that's the API for update users. Now the last function in this controller is delete, or in Laravel it is usually called destroy. And it only expecting an ID similar like in the user details. For delete, it is very simple. First get the user object where id is equal to id. Then if it's not exists, we return not found response as usual. And what we need is to just delete the user. So user function. For the response, for delete, it is usually a null response. So we don't expect any return object, and the correct status for the null or no content response is 204. Then we can add in the root API, so it will be delete operation with the URL is user and the ID with the action of destroy. That's it, and we can test in the Postman. So let's run the application first. For delete, we can copy from this one to create a request, change the title, and change the operation to delete, and that's all with the bearer token and nothing in the body. Now let's try to send the delete request. Now it's successful. It's not returning anything because in the API we're returning a null with 204 status. And let's check in the user list. Now it's updated, and currently we only have user with ID number 2. That's all for the user controller. Now we come into the business logic with the new controller, which is the attendance controller. So let's create the controller first. PHP artisan make controller attendance controller. Let's look inside it. The first API is the clock in, so let's create the function public function clock in with expecting a request object. What we will do here is first get the user ID and then find the attendance if it exists. If it is not exist, then we create a new attendance object. After attendance object created, then we can do the clock in. and the last is return the response. Let's start from the top. To get the user ID is we need to get the user object first, request user, and then get the ID. Next is find attendance if exists. So attendance, we will use the attendance class where we will use two where clause in here. First, we check the attendance based on the date. Let's check if the date is today. For the date, we will use the help of Carbon class. Carbon is a class for managing time and date in Laravel. So we will use a Carbon today method. After getting where date is today, and next where clause is if the user ID is equal to the user ID of the requester, then we will get the object. Should be where. Now we need to import the Carbon class first, which is Carbon. Now we will check if the attendance is not exist, then we will create a new one. So attendance is attendance create with the parameter of first user ID, which we can get from the user ID object from above. Next is the date, which should be today, so we will gonna use the Carbon function again. If we check in the attendance table in the database migration and attendance, we will see that the date and the user ID is not nullable, so the minimum parameter to create an attendance object is the date and the user ID, but the clock in and clock out is nullable. So let's get back to the attendance controller. Now after we have the attendance, if it is not exist, it will create new one. If it is already exist, then we go to the next operation. Then we check again if the attendance is already have clock in data. If not, then we will add the clock in data in the attendance object. So attendance clock in is equal to Carbon. Now we use the now functions, which include the time and date. And next we will save the attendance object. This logic means if the attendance object is already have a clock in, then we will not add a new clock in data. So only the first clock in data will be saved in the database. Then we can return the response in JSON of the attendance with the status of 200. Next we add the root, so let's add a new controller here. For the attendance is the same with user, it all needs an authorization, so we can define the middleware in the group middleware sanctum, then the controller class, which is attendance controller, then we can group it. The first root is post operation, with the URL of attendance / clock-in, and the function name is clock-in. That's it, and now we can try to test in the Postman. But first let's run the application first. We can copy the request from here. So the name would be clock-in, and it is a post request, and the URL is attendance / clock-in. For the body, we don't send anything, but we need the bearer token for that. So let's try to test. Now it return succeed, and now we have the first attendance of the user ID number 2 with the clock in data in here and the date of today date. Now if we check in the database, we can check on the attendance, and we can see that the first attendance object is already created. The data is saved in the UTC format. And now let's continue to the clockout API. For the clockout function, it can be very similar with the clock-in function, and we can copy most of them. So let's split the screen and let's create the clockout public function, clockout a request object, the first step is the same, get the user ID from the user object, and second is get the attendance if exists. The third step is if it not exists, it will create a new attendance object. And here is the difference for clock out. In the clock in, we check if the attendance have clock in data. If it have, we are not updating the data. But for the clock out, it will update with the latest clock out data. So it would be clock out is equal to now time. And we will save the attendance. For the response is still the same. We will giving back the response. So it's very similar function. And next we updating the root. Pretty much the same, still using post function, so we can just copy and edit some part to be clock out. Now let's run the application. We can copy from the clock in request, change the title to clock out and the URL to be clock out. Let's check the authorization, because when I test the clock in is yesterday, so let's do the clock in one more time. Now it succeed and we can see the data, and let's check in the database and press refresh. The clock out still empty, and if we hit the clock out API and return succeed, now we have clock in and clock out data together. And if we check in the database, now it's already filled. The next function is the reports. So public function reports, and we expecting two parameter. First, the request object, and second is the ID of the user that we want to get the reports. So first we get the input validation, and the next is to get all the attendance, and it is filtered by the user ID and also by the date range. So we can specify the start date and end date of the attendance that we want to get. And the last is just returning the response. So in the input validation, because we already get the user ID from here, we also need to get the other parameter of the date range in here in the input validation. So let's create the object of validated input as usual, and we can get that from the request and validate. What we want to get as an input here is the start date and the end date. The validation rules is it is required, and the format should be a date. The same apply to the end date as well. And this is will be sent in the query parameter in the URL. So after we get all the key, start, and the ID, and the next we will get the attendance object and query it with the user ID and the date range. So the object would be attendance because it's plural. For the query we use the attendance class helper and write the where class in here, where user ID equal to ID from here. This is the first where clause, and the next where clause is we are using the where between. It is take the two parameter. The first is the name of the column in the database, which is date in our case, and the second parameter is an array which contain two parameter, the start and the end range. So the start of the date range would be from the validated input of start, and the second is the end range, which would be the validated and end. And after is filtered by two where class, we can sort the results, for example using order by. In here we are using the date as the column with the method of ascending. So the earlier dates is in the first result, and then the last step is to use get function, which will have a result of array. So this object will be an array. And the last is just return the response JSON of the attendance, and the status would be 200. And that's all for the report function. Next we add the root. For the report we will using a get request, so root get, and the URL is attendance slash reports slash ID. ID is the ID of the users, and the function name is reports. Now we can run the application. Let's create the request. You can duplicate from here. The title would be reports and it will be get operation, and the URL is reports and the ID. So currently if we check in the user list, we only have one user with ID number 2, and in the database, if we check in the attendance, that the user ID number 2 have 2 attendance in here, so we can get example of the array because it have more than one attendance. So let's try to run the API, and the ID is 2, and for the date range parameter we can add in the query parameter, so it would be start and end date. For example, the value is in the whole September, so it would be 2022, and in September from the 1st until the last date of September, which is 30. This would be the request. Attendance reports the user ID, which is 2, and the start date and the end date of the report that we want to filter. So let's try to send the request. Now we have the results of 2 attendance here. In here we only have the clock in for the first data, and in the second data it have clock in and clock out, the same like in the database. So that is the API for reports. The last function would be the all reports. So let's create the function, public functions, let's say all reports, and expecting a request object. The difference between reports and all reports is in all reports we get all the user with all the attendance for each user. So it's not specific to one user but for all users. And for the step is first input validation. Next we get all users together with the attendance. And we'll filter it by the date range. And the last is returning response. For the input validation, it is the same with the reports function, so we can just copy it. And for the users, so we'll create the users object first, and because to get the user we are using the user class, and also need to loading the attendance class for each user. So in Eloquent it have eager loading function with the keyword with. For example, we specify the relationship because user have relationship has many with attendance, so one user can have many attendance. We can simply write the relationship name, for example attendance, and it will load the user with each attendance. But because the attendance would also have a query or filter of the date range, now we inputting an array because we will do the query with the attendance also. So attendance have function of query, and we will use the variable first start range and second the end range. Because we don't have that variable, now let's create first. So the start is from the validated start and end is from the validated end. Now we can use the query for the attendance. We using the query here, query. The first where clause is the where between to filter using a date, and it needs two variable, the start and end. So it will get from this variable. After that we can ordering the attendance like in the report function. So order by date and with ascending method. Now after the query is finished, next we will get the object, but we need to import the user model first. So use app models and user, so not error anymore. And the last is returning the response, return a response JSON and users with the status of 200. Next we add the root, and we can copy from the previous API, so the operation still same get, and we remove the ID, so it just reports and change the function to all reports. And let's try to run the application. PHP artisan serve. Because we only have one user in the database, I add a new user with register API, and I also do the clock in, so the attendance have another record for the new user, which is the ID is number 4. So we have 2 user and 3 attendance record. And let's create the test in Postman. We can copy from the reports. Let's duplicate this one and change the title to all reports and remove the ID. And let's try to run. Now the result is array of object, and each object is a user object with the additional object of attendance also in array, and it can have multiple attendance. So for example, this user ID number 2 have 2 attendance and can be seen here. And for the new user with ID number 4, currently there are no attendance because the date range is still using the old one because I record this in a different day. So let's extend the date, for example, until 30 of October and try to rerun the test, and the result is the ID number 4 is also have the attendance. So like in the database it have 2 user and 3 attendance. Now back to the attendance controller. If we check in the reports and all report function, anyone who can log in can see the data of any user, and that's probably not that we want. So we can add an authorization not only for the login such as username and password, but also adding an authorization for the role. To do that, we are gonna use the one of the function of authorization in Laravel, which is gets. Gets is a simple way to determine if the user are authorized to do some things. So like in the reports function, the one that should be able to see the reports is the user itself. So for example, authorize for the user itself and the admin. So if the user ID number 2, it can check the report for the ID number 2, but cannot check the report of the ID number, for example 4. And for all reports, it will authorize only for the admin, because in all reports is displaying all the user with all the attendance, so only the admin can have the rights to do that. To register the gates, we open the folder of app, http, and the provider. At there we can go into the out service provider and define the gates inside the boot method and under the register policy. To register the gate, we simply use the gate class to define the authorizations. The first parameter is the name of the access. For example, it will be reports, and the second parameter is the function that accepting a user the first parameter is always the user object that is logged in, so we can have at least one parameter, and we can also add the second parameter here, for example the user ID report. We will use this variable to check the user ID of the report. So for example, the user login is the ID is 2 and it want to check the report with the user ID number 4, so it will reject. So we need to compare the login user and the user ID of the report that want to be checked. And for the next, we add a closure, and this would be the function of the get. But first let's import the library for gets, and user for the get would be illuminate support package and get. And for the user, app models and user. Should be no error for this one. Now for the function, it will have an if condition and it will check a certain requirement, and if it is passed, it will return true, else it will return false. The condition that we want to check is regarding the user role. First, we need to check the user role by get role and the name, and check if it is equal to admin. The role is get from the user object. If we check in the user class, it have a relationship role and it will return a role object, and one of the parameter in the role is the name. We can check it in the database. For roles, we will have two data in the roles. First is admin and second is employee. So in the out service provider, it will get the name of the role and check if it is equal to admin. Another condition is we check the ID. If the user ID is equal to user ID report, so user ID is equal to user ID report, then it can pass the get, so continue to the report function. And let's implement the get in the attendance controller. So we will do the authorization here to authorize and check if the user is admin or the user itself. There are multiple ways to check on the gets. One of them is use get denies function, and it will check the name of the get, which is reports, because the first parameter is always the user and we have second parameter which is the ID. We pass the second parameter in here, so it is ID. If it denies, it will return an error response. Of, for example, the message with the unauthorized message with the status of 403. But first we need to import the library, we can copy from here the get library, and we can try to test the get for reports. So let's run the application. And open the Postman. First we can try to use our first user to get the token. We will use this token and try to do report API. But first let's check the user. It have the ID of 2, so naturally it can check itself, and the role ID is 2, which is employee. So this should be succeed. But if we try to see the other reports, for example ID number 4, it will be denied by the gates, forbidden. Now let's change this user manually to be an admin. So because we know there are 2 roles, first is admin, second is employee, and we can change the user to admin in a safe way, for example in the database directly. So we can change the role ID to 1, and it will make the user ID number 2 as an admin. And if we try to run the API again, it should be succeed because now it is an admin. Let's extend the dates so we can see some data. Now it can check other user reports. And for the second get in our report, we are using the same get. We can copy from here, but we don't need the ID because we only check for the role of the user, because for all report only the admin can do that. So we can remove the ID and update the get a little bit. So for example we initialize this with null, so the second comparison will always be wrong for this one, and we'll only check for the role. And we can try to run the application. Let's copy the latest token from here. This is the token from the admin, and because this is an admin, they should be able to run through the API. Now it's working because this user is an admin. Let's save this to a note and test for the second user. This is for the admin, ID 2, and let's get the token for the second user with the email and password. Let me check in the database what is the second email. Copy the value and replace in here. For the password, I think it's secret password. Let's test. Okay, the token number 12 is the token for the employee, and let's save in here first. ID 4, and let's check again with the new token. It should be forbidden because this token is from the employee account, and that's how we are using the gates in the attendance controller. There is another way to do the authorization besides gates, which is policy. We can put the logic around the model, so we will comparing the user against the model. To create policy, we can use the artisan command with php artisan make policy, and the name is user policy. It will create a folder here under HTTP, and we can delete the default first and write the policy based on the function from the user controller. So let's check from the user controller first. In here we have 4 function: index, show, update, and destroy. So we will have 4 function in here. Let's start from the index. Public function index, and we expecting a user. And here we can do the if condition to check the user roles. So if user role name is equal to admin, and it will return true, else it will deny. So we can write with this deny, and the message is unauthorized, for example. And let's continue to create for the second function, which is show. For index, only admin can do the function, but for the show, beside admin, the user also can see themselves. So we expecting 2 parameter here: first the user, and second the model. The model here is actually also a user, and we name it with different name. If we put the policy against other model, for example a post, then the 2 variable here will be a user and the post. But now the model currently is also a user object. So in here we add a or user ID is equal to model ID. So if user ID 2 want to see model of the user ID2, then it can do that. Now after we create these two policy, we need to register the policy in the out service provider, like in this example. So in our case, the model is the user class, and the policy name is the user policy. Now let's implement in the user controller. So to implement that, we can use the authorize function with this authorize and the name of the ability, which is the name of our function in the user policy, and we have index as the function name. And for the second argument is the model, but because we only expecting one variable in here, we can just give the class, the empty class. So this would be okay. And for the second implementation in the show, we can have the authorization here because we need the model. So this authorize the name of the function, which is the same in our case, and the argument or the model, which is the user. Now it should be okay, and we can test now. Let's run the application. And if we open the user list function, we will use first the admin token, and it should be working. And if we use the employee token, then it should be rejected. And let's test for the user detail or show API. This is the admin token. It can see itself or it can see other user. But if we use the employee token, and it should be able to check on himself, but if it try to check the other user, it should be forbidden or unauthorized. There are two more policy for the user controller, which is update and destroy. So let's create the function. For update, we're expecting a model, so the parameter are similar with the show policy. So it's user and user model. For the authorization, it's also the same. The user can update himself, but admin can update everyone. So we can directly copy this function into the update function. And for the destroy, it would be similar with the index, that the person or role that can delete or destroy the user is only the admin. So we can just copy all from this and change the name of the function to destroy. And for the implementation in user controller, it's similar with the show. For the update, it will be placed after the user is found. So this authorize the name of the policy, which is update, and the user model in this case is user. And for the destroy, you can put it in the top with this authorize destroy, because we only expect one parameter. The second parameter would be just a class. And that's it. Let's try in the Postman. First we need to run the application. For update user, we need to check the data in the database first. So there are 2 users, and we will update the user with ID number 4 with the user itself. So we need the token from the user ID number 4. The authorization change to 12, and the ID would be 4. The body would be like this. So from Mike to John. Let's try. Now it succeed, and check in the database. Now it has been changed, and if the user try to edit the other user, it should be forbidden, because the user role is employee, so it cannot edit other user. But if we try to use the token from the admin, and let's change it first, and it try to edit the other user. For example, we add the name John new, because the user is an admin, it can edit other user. And let's check in the database, it's already updated. And for the delete, the only user that can do the delete function is the admin role. So let's try to use the employee role first. Change the authorization. This should be forbidden. And if we change the token to be an admin, then it should be able to do that. So let's try to delete the user, and succeed. And if you check in the database, it's already deleted. And that's all for the gates and user policy. And thank you for watching this tutorial.